When Eli Dawson spent his last $50 on the smallest, weakest foal anyone in Millbrook had ever seen, the crowd laughed so hard, some of them couldn't breathe. They stopped laughing the day she crossed a finish line that their champion horses couldn't reach. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The auction barn smelled of hay and desperation, that peculiar mixture of animal sweat and human hope that clung to places where fortunes changed hands and dreams were bought or sold by the pound. Eli Dawson stood at the back of the crowd with $50 in his pocket and nothing else to his name except the clothes on his back and the battered hat that had belonged to his father. He was 47 years old, weathered by a lifetime of working other men's land, and he had come to the Millbrook horse auction with nothing left to lose. The year was 1892, and the Colorado frontier was changing faster than a man could keep up with. The big ranches were swallowing the small ones, the railroads were carving up the open range, and cowboys like Eli were becoming relics of an age that hadn't quite finished dying. He had spent 25 years breaking horses for Clayton Mercer's outfit, sleeping in bunkhouses and eating trail dust, building nothing that belonged to him. Then last month, Mercer had sold out to a cattle company from back east, and just like that, Eli found himself standing on a dirt road with his severance pay and nowhere to go. $50. It was supposed to last him until he found new work, but jobs were scarce for aging cowboys with bad knees and hands that ached in the cold. Most of the ranches wanted young men who could ride 16 hours without complaint, not veterans who had already given their best years to someone else's dream. The auctioneer's voice cut through Eli's thoughts, calling out lot numbers and prices that seemed to climb higher with each passing minute. Fine horses went for hundreds of dollars, bought by ranchers in clean shirts and polished boots, who had never known what it meant to count pennies or wonder where their next meal would come from. Eli watched them with a mixture of envy and resignation, knowing he didn't belong in this world of money and possibility. He was about to leave when he saw her. She stood in a small pen at the far edge of the auction yard, separated from the other horses like something shameful that needed to be hidden away. A white foal, barely 3 months old, so small that she looked more like a large dog than a horse. Her coat was the color of fresh cream, unmarked by any spot or blemish, and her eyes held a strange intelligence that made Eli stop in his tracks. But it was her size that drew the most attention, or rather the lack of it, She was easily the smallest foal he had ever seen, stunted and delicate, the kind of animal that most horsemen would have put down at birth rather than waste feed on a creature that would never amount to anything. The sign on her pen read simply, Lot 47. Starting bid, $40. Eli found himself moving toward the pen without conscious thought, drawn by something he couldn't name. The foal watched him approach, her ears pricking forward with curiosity rather than fear. When he reached the fence, she stretched her neck toward him, her soft muzzle brushing against his calloused fingers with a gentleness that made his heart ache. "You're a tiny thing, aren't you?" he murmured, scratching behind her ears. "What's a little ghost like you doing in a place like this?" "She's a runt," said a voice behind him. Eli turned to find a young ranch hand leaning against a nearby post, tobacco juice staining the corners of his mouth. Dam rejected her the day she was born. Had to hand feed her for weeks just to keep her alive. Boss wanted to shoot her, but his daughter begged him to give her a chance. The young man spat into the dust. "Waste of time, if you ask me. She'll never be big enough to ride, never be strong enough to work. Probably won't even survive the winter." "Nobody asked you," Eli replied quietly, his eyes never leaving the foal. The young man shrugged and wandered off, leaving Eli alone with the creature that the rest of the world had already written off as worthless. He knew he should walk away. $50 was all he had, and spending it on a stunted foal that might not live another month was the kind of foolish decision that separated dreamers from survivors on the frontier. but there was something in those dark eyes, something that reminded him of his own reflection in still water. A creature dismissed and discounted, told by everyone that she would never amount to anything, fighting just to exist in a world that had no use for her. Eli had felt that way his whole life, always the hired hand and never the owner, always building someone else's future while his own remained forever out of reach. The auctioneer called out lot 47, and Eli watched as the bidding opened at $40. No one raised a paddle. The auctioneer called again, his voice tinged with boredom, clearly eager to move on to more valuable stock. Still no bids. He was about to declare the lot unsold when Eli raised his hand. $50, he called out, his voice carrying across the auction yard with a steadiness that surprised even himself. The auctioneer's eyebrows rose and scattered laughter rippled through the crowd. Eli heard someone mutter about fools and their money, but he kept his eyes fixed on the small white foal, who was watching him with an expression that almost seemed like hope. $50, going once, going twice. The gavel fell. Sold to the gentleman in the back. Eli walked to the pen and opened the gate, kneeling down to meet the foal at eye level. She came to him without hesitation, pressing her forehead against his chest as if she had been waiting for him all along. He wrapped his arms around her thin neck, feeling the rapid flutter of her heartbeat, and made a promise that he had no logical reason to believe he could keep. "I'm going to prove them all wrong," he whispered into her cream-colored mane. "We're going to prove them all wrong together." He named her Ghost, and with nothing but $50 worth of faith and a lifetime of stubbornness, Eli Dawson began the journey that would become legend. The first winter nearly killed them both. Eli had found work at a small ranch outside of Millbrook, trading his labor for a corner of the barn where he and Ghost could shelter from the Colorado cold. The owner, a widow named Martha Hensley, had looked at the tiny foal with the same skeptical expression Eli had seen at the auction, but something in his eyes must have convinced her to give them a chance. "You're a fool for buying that animal," Martha said on the first morning, watching Eli prepare a mixture of warm milk and oats for Ghost's breakfast. "She'll never be worth the feed you're putting into her." "Maybe so," Eli replied, not looking up from his work. "But I've been called a fool my whole life. Might as well earn the title." Ghost had arrived at the Hensley Ranch weak and trembling, her small body struggling against the bitter November winds that swept down from the mountains. The veterinarian who stopped by to check on Martha's cattle took one look at the foal and shook his head. "She's got maybe a 50-50 chance of making it to spring," he said, pulling Eli aside where Ghost couldn't hear, as if the animal might somehow understand. "Her lungs are weak and she's not growing the way she should. If I were you, I'd start preparing myself for the worst." But Eli had never been good at preparing for the worst. He had spent his entire life fighting against the reasonable expectations of others, and he wasn't about to stop now. He moved his bedroll into Ghost's stall, sleeping beside her on the cold barn floor so he could monitor her breathing through the night. When she caught a fever in December, he stayed awake for 3 days straight, cooling her forehead with damp cloths and forcing water down her throat one careful sip at a time. The other ranch hands thought he had lost his mind. They watched him care for the stunted foal with a mixture of pity and contempt, making jokes about the old cowboy who had bet his last dollar on a lost cause. Eli ignored them, pouring every ounce of his energy into keeping Ghost alive, talking to her in the quiet hours of the night about the life they would build together once spring came. "You're going to be something special," he would whisper, stroking her thin neck as the wind howled outside. "I don't care what anyone says. I saw it in your eyes the first time we met. You've got more heart than any horse I've ever known, and heart is what matters in this world. Everything else can be learned." Ghost would press her muzzle against his palm, her dark eyes reflecting the lamplight, and Eli would feel something he hadn't experienced in years: purpose. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just surviving from one day to the next. He was building something, nurturing something, betting everything on a future that most people couldn't see. By February, the worst of the illness had passed. Ghost was still small, still fragile compared to the other horses on the ranch, but she was alive, and that was more than anyone had expected. Eli began taking her for short walks around the barn, letting her stretch her legs and explore the world beyond her stall. She moved with a cautious grace that belied her size, her hooves finding sure footing even on icy ground. Martha Hensley noticed the change first. "She's got spirit, I'll give her that," the widow admitted one morning, watching Ghost trot alongside Eli across the frozen pasture. "The way she moves, it's like she's dancing rather than walking. Never seen anything quite like it." "She's learning to trust her body," Eli said, a smile creasing his weathered face. "Once she figures out what she's capable of, there'll be no stopping her." Spring arrived slowly, melting the snow and revealing the green promise beneath. Ghost grew stronger with each passing week, though she remained noticeably smaller than other horses her age. What she lacked in size, however, she made up for in intelligence and agility. She learned commands faster than any horse Eli had ever trained, responding to subtle shifts in his weight and tone of voice that most animals would never notice. "It's like she reads your mind," Martha observed, watching Eli work with Ghost in the corral one April afternoon. The foal was now 6 months old, still too young to ride, but old enough to begin the patient work of training. "I've been around horses my whole life, and I've never seen one pick things up so quick." Eli nodded, running his hand along Ghost's gleaming white coat. She had filled out over the winter, though she would never be a large horse. Her legs were slender but strong, built for speed rather than power, and her chest had developed a depth that suggested endurance beyond what her frame would indicate. "She knows she's got something to prove," Eli said quietly. "Every time someone looks at her with doubt in their eyes, she remembers, and she's determined to make them regret it." That summer, word began to spread through Millbrook about the strange white horse at the Hensley Ranch. People stopped by just to see her, curious about the runt that the old cowboy had saved from the auction. Most of them left shaking their heads, unable to see past Ghost's diminutive size to the potential that Eli recognized in every movement she made. But a few saw what he saw. A few looked into those dark, intelligent eyes and glimpsed something extraordinary waiting to emerge. "What are you going to do with her?" Martha asked one evening as they sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple. "She's not built for ranch work, that's for certain." Eli was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant peaks. "I've heard about a race," he said finally. "Up in Denver. They call it the Rocky Mountain Endurance. 50 miles across the roughest terrain in the territory. Nobody gives small horses a chance in that kind of race." He turned to look at Martha, and there was fire in his eyes. "I'm going to enter Ghost, and we're going to win." Martha Hensley stared at Eli as if he had just announced his intention to fly to the moon. The Rocky Mountain Endurance was not a race for dreamers and their undersized horses. It was a brutal test of strength and stamina that had broken some of the finest animals in the territory, a 50-mile gauntlet through mountain passes and river crossings that left even the strongest competitors struggling to finish. "You've lost your mind," Martha said flatly. "That race has killed horses twice Ghost's size. The entry fee alone is more money than you've made in the past 6 months." "Then I'll work harder," Eli replied, his jaw set with the kind of stubborn determination that had carried him through every hardship life had thrown his way. "I'll take on extra jobs, save every penny. The race isn't until next September. That gives me over a year to prepare." Martha shook her head, but there was something in her expression that wasn't quite disapproval. "And if you lose? If Ghost breaks down on those mountain trails and you're left with nothing?" Then I'll be exactly where I started, Eli said simply, a broke cowboy with nothing but a dream. But at least I'll know I tried. The training began the next morning, before the sun had fully risen over the eastern peaks. Eli started Ghost on short runs across the pasture, building her endurance gradually while paying careful attention to any signs of strain or weakness. She took to the work with an enthusiasm that surprised even him, her small hooves churning up the dust as she raced alongside him, her cream-colored mane streaming behind her like a banner of defiance. Word of Eli's ambition spread through Millbrook like wildfire, and the reactions were predictably mixed. Some people thought he was brave, a romantic figure chasing an impossible dream. Others thought he was a fool, wasting his time on a horse that would never amount to anything, but most people simply didn't care, too busy with their own struggles to pay much attention to an aging cowboy and his diminutive white foal. The one person who took notice was someone Eli had never expected to meet. His name was Thomas Blackwood, and he owned the largest horse breeding operation in Colorado. He arrived at the Hensley Ranch one July afternoon in a gleaming black carriage, his expensive suit and polished boots marking him as a man of considerable wealth and influence. Eli watched him approach with a mixture of curiosity and wariness, wondering what business a man like Blackwood could possibly have with the likes of him. "I've heard about your horse," Blackwood said without preamble, his sharp eyes scanning the pasture until they found Ghost grazing near the fence line. "The white runt you pulled from the auction. People say you're planning to enter her in the endurance." "People say a lot of things," Eli replied carefully. "Most of it isn't worth repeating." Blackwood smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I've been breeding horses for 30 years, Mr. Dawson. I know quality when I see it, and I know waste when I see it. That animal will never win a race against properly bred stock. She's too small, too fragile, too everything that a champion horse shouldn't be." "Then you've got nothing to worry about," Eli said, meeting Blackwood's gaze without flinching. "Why bother coming all the way out here to tell me what I already know?" The wealthy breeder's smile faded. "Because I don't like uncertainty. I have 3 horses entered in next year's endurance, and I expect one of them to win. I'm prepared to offer you $500 for that foal, right here and now. That's 10 times what you paid for her, and more money than you'll earn in the next 2 years of honest labor." $500. It was a fortune to a man like Eli, enough to start over somewhere new, to buy his own small piece of land and build a life that didn't depend on the charity of others. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine what that kind of security would feel like, the weight of worry lifting from his shoulders after a lifetime of struggle. Then he looked at Ghost, who had raised her head at the sound of voices and was watching him with those dark, trusting eyes. She had fought so hard to survive, had defied every expectation and overcome every obstacle, and she had done it because she believed in him, because he had believed in her when no one else would. "She's not for sale," Eli said quietly. "Not for $500, not for $5,000. She's worth more than anything you could offer." Blackwood's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake, Dawson. I'm not a man who takes kindly to being refused." "Then we have something in common," Eli replied. "Because I'm not a man who takes kindly to being threatened." The wealthy breeder climbed back into his carriage without another word, but Eli could feel the promise of trouble in the way he looked back at Ghost before the driver urged the horses forward. Thomas Blackwood was not accustomed to hearing the word no, and men like that had ways of making their displeasure felt. That evening, Eli sat in Ghost's stall, brushing her coat until it gleamed like moonlight on fresh snow. She stood perfectly still under his ministrations, occasionally turning her head to nuzzle his shoulder in quiet affection. "We just made a powerful enemy," he told her, his voice soft in the gathering darkness. A man like Blackwood doesn't forget a slight, and he doesn't forgive a challenge. He's going to do everything he can to make sure we fail." Ghost snorted softly, as if the threat meant nothing to her. "You're right," Eli said, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "We've faced worse odds than some rich man with hurt feelings, and we're still here." He pressed his forehead against her neck, drawing strength from her steady presence. "We're still here, and we're not going anywhere." The trouble started small, the way it always does when powerful men decide to make their displeasure known. First, it was whispers in town. Rumors that Eli Dawson was mistreating his horse, pushing her too hard in training, caring more about his foolish dream than the animal's welfare. Then it was the feed supplier who suddenly couldn't fill his orders, claiming shortages that mysteriously didn't affect any other customer. Then it was the farrier who had been shooing Ghost for months, apologetically explaining that he could no longer work with Eli's horse due to scheduling conflicts. Martha Hensley watched these developments with growing concern. "Blackwood's behind this," she said one evening, as Eli struggled to file down Ghost's hooves himself in the dim light of the barn. "He's trying to make things so difficult that you'll give up and sell her to him." "I know," Eli replied, not looking up from his work. "But giving up isn't something I've ever been good at." The months passed, and with them came new challenges and small victories. Eli learned to do things himself that he had always relied on others for, becoming farrier and veterinarian and trainer all in one. Ghost continued to grow stronger, her endurance increasing with each passing week, her movements becoming more fluid and confident as she learned to trust her own capabilities. By the time winter arrived again, Ghost was 1.5 years old and ready to begin carrying a rider. Eli approached this milestone with a mixture of excitement and trepidation, knowing that many horses who seemed gentle on the ground became unpredictable once someone climbed onto their backs. But Ghost accepted the saddle as if she had been waiting for it her whole life, standing perfectly still while Eli adjusted the straps and checked the fit. "Easy now," he murmured, placing his foot in the stirrup and slowly lifting himself onto her back. "We're going to take this nice and slow." Ghost turned her head to look at him, her dark eyes calm and trusting. Then she took her first step forward, carrying him as naturally as if they had been partners for years rather than moments. Eli felt tears prick at his eyes, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had accomplished together. This tiny creature that everyone had dismissed as worthless was now carrying him across the pasture, her gait smooth and steady, her spirit unbroken by all the hardships she had endured. "That's my girl," he whispered, patting her neck. "That's my beautiful, impossible girl." Spring brought news that made Eli's blood run cold. Thomas Blackwood had been busy during the winter months, using his wealth and influence to change the rules of the Rocky Mountain Endurance. The entry fee had been doubled and new requirements had been added that seemed specifically designed to exclude horses like Ghost. Minimum height restrictions, breeding documentation, veterinary certifications from approved examiners, all of whom happened to be on Blackwood's payroll. "He's trying to keep you out of the race," Martha said, reading the new regulations aloud from the newspaper. "And he's doing it legally, so there's nothing you can do about it." Eli sat in silence, his weathered hands clenched into fists on the kitchen table. He had saved every penny he could spare for the past year, working double shifts and taking on jobs that men half his age would have found exhausting. The increased entry fee alone would wipe out everything he had set aside, and the veterinary certification would cost even more, assuming he could even find an approved examiner willing to work with him. "There has to be a way," he said finally. "I didn't come this far to let a rich man's spite stop me." The answer came from an unexpected source. A letter arrived at the Hensley Ranch 3 days later, addressed to Eli in an elegant feminine hand. Inside was a single page of cream-colored stationery and a bank draft for $300. "Dear Mr. Dawson," the letter read, My name is Elizabeth Blackwood, and I am Thomas Blackwood's daughter. I have heard about your horse and your dream, and I want you to know that not everyone in my family shares my father's views. I believe in giving every creature a chance to prove their worth, regardless of the circumstances of their birth. Please accept this contribution toward your entry fee and know that there is at least one person who will be cheering for you and Ghost when you cross that starting line. Sincerely, Elizabeth. Eli read the letter 3 times, unable to believe what he was seeing. Thomas Blackwood's own daughter was secretly supporting his rival, risking her father's wrath to help an aging cowboy and his undersized horse chase an impossible dream. "Well," Martha said, peering over his shoulder at the bank draft. "It seems you've got an angel looking out for you." "Or a spy," Eli replied cautiously. "This could be a trick to get my guard down." But something in his gut told him the letter was genuine. He had seen enough of the world to recognize sincerity when he encountered it, and Elizabeth Blackwood's words carried the weight of conviction rather than deception. She was taking a tremendous risk by helping him, and that kind of courage deserved to be honored. He wrote back that evening a simple note of gratitude that said everything he couldn't express in elaborate prose. Then he took the bank draft to town and deposited it in his account, watching his dream inch one step closer to reality. "We're going to make it, Ghost," he told her that night, sitting in her stall as the stars wheeled overhead through the open barn door. "Against all odds, against everyone who said we couldn't. We're going to show them what heart can accomplish." Ghost nickered softly in response, her white coat glowing in the moonlight like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. The summer before the race became a crucible that tested everything Eli and Ghost had built together. He pushed them both harder than ever before, riding through mountain trails that would have challenged horses twice Ghost's size, swimming across rivers that ran cold with snowmelt, climbing passes where the air grew thin and every breath felt like a victory. Ghost never faltered, never complained, her small hooves finding purchase on terrain that would have sent lesser animals tumbling into the abyss. "She's something special," admitted Doc Harmon, the only veterinarian in 3 counties who wasn't on Blackwood's payroll. The old man had agreed to provide the required certification after hearing Eli's story, driving out to the Hensley Ranch one August afternoon to examine Ghost with the thoroughness of someone who took his profession seriously. "Her heart rate recovery is unlike anything I've seen. Most horses her size would be struggling after the kind of training you've put her through, but she bounces back faster than animals with twice her muscle mass." "She's got something to prove," Eli said, watching Ghost trot around the corral with easy grace. "We both do." Doc Harmon signed the certification papers and handed them over with a firm handshake. "I'll be at that race," he said. "Wouldn't miss it for the world." About time someone showed Thomas Blackwood that he doesn't own everything in this territory. The weeks leading up to September brought a flurry of activity and anticipation. News of Eli's entry had spread beyond Millbrook, and people from neighboring towns began stopping by the Hensley Ranch to catch a glimpse of the white horse that was challenging the established order. Some came to mock, others to marvel, but all of them left with stories to tell about the aging cowboy and his impossible dream. Elizabeth Blackwood sent another letter, this one warning that her father had entered his 3 best horses and was determined to crush any competition that dared to challenge his dominance. The favorite was a massive black stallion named Sovereign, bred from champion bloodlines and trained by the finest horsemen money could buy. He had won every race he had entered for the past 2 years, and the betting odds heavily favored him to claim another victory. "Sovereign is fast," Elizabeth wrote, "Bone, but he's also arrogant, like my father. He doesn't know how to dig deep when things get difficult because things have never been difficult for him. Ghost has something he doesn't: the memory of struggle, the knowledge of what it means to fight for survival. Don't let his reputation intimidate you. Champions are made in adversity, not in comfort." Eli read these words so many times that he memorized them, carrying their wisdom with him like a talisman against doubt. Elizabeth had never met him, had never seen Ghost run, yet somehow she understood what they were fighting for better than people who had watched their journey from the beginning. The night before they left for Denver, Eli sat in Ghost's stall one final time, brushing her coat until it shone like polished ivory. She stood perfectly still under his hands, her breathing slow and steady, her eyes half closed in contentment. "Tomorrow everything changes," he told her quietly. "Win or lose, nothing will ever be the same after this race. We've come too far, made too much noise for things to go back to the way they were." He set down the brush and cupped her face in his hands, looking directly into those dark, intelligent eyes. "But I want you to know something, Ghost. No matter what happens out there, I'm proud of you. I'm proud of everything you've overcome, everything you've become. You taught an old cowboy that it's never too late to dream, and that's worth more than any trophy or prize money." Ghost pressed her forehead against his chest, the gesture so tender and trusting that Eli felt his heart swell with an emotion he couldn't name. Love, perhaps, though he had never thought of himself as the kind of man who could love a horse the way other men loved their families. But Ghost wasn't just a horse to him anymore. She was proof that the world could still surprise you, that miracles could emerge from the most unlikely circumstances, that believing in something against all evidence was sometimes the bravest thing a person could do. Martha Hensley drove them to Denver in her wagon, the 50-mile journey taking 2 full days over rough roads that seemed determined to shake them apart. Ghost traveled well, standing calmly in the back of the wagon while the landscape unfolded around them in waves of gold and green. When they finally crested the hill overlooking Denver, Eli caught his breath at the sight of the city spread out below, its buildings gleaming in the afternoon sun like a promise of possibility. The race grounds were already crowded when they arrived, filled with horses and handlers and spectators who had come from across the territory to witness the most prestigious endurance race in Colorado. Eli felt the weight of their stares as he led Ghost through the registration area, heard the whispers that followed in their wake like shadows. Most of the other entrants barely gave them a second glance, dismissing the small white mare and her weathered rider as curiosities rather than competitors. But Thomas Blackwood noticed. He was standing near the official's tent with his entourage of trainers and handlers, his 3 magnificent horses gleaming with health and arrogance behind him. When his eyes found Eli across the crowded grounds, his expression twisted into something ugly and cold. "So you actually came," Blackwood said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I was betting you'd come to your senses and stay home." "You should know by now," Eli replied, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "I'm not a man who backs down from a challenge." Ghost stood beside him, small but proud, her white coat catching the sunlight like a beacon of defiance. The morning of the race dawned cold and clear, the September sun painting the Rocky Mountains in shades of amber and rose. Eli had barely slept, his mind racing with possibilities and fears that seemed to multiply in the darkness. But when he went to check on Ghost in the temporary stables, he found her calm and alert, her eyes bright with an eagerness that steadied his nerves. "You're ready for this, aren't you?" he murmured, running his hands along her neck. "You've been ready your whole life." 23 horses had entered the Rocky Mountain Endurance, representing the finest breeding operations and wealthiest ranches in the territory. They lined up at the starting area in a mass of muscle and ambition, their riders dressed in expensive gear that made Eli's worn leather and faded denim look almost comical by comparison. Ghost stood among them like a lamb among wolves, her small frame dwarfed by the towering animals on either side. The course would take them 50 miles through some of the most challenging terrain in Colorado, climbing mountain passes that reached over 10,000 feet, crossing rivers swollen with early autumn rains, navigating rocky trails where a single misstep could mean disaster. There were checkpoints every 10 miles where veterinarians would examine each horse, and any animal showing signs of distress would be pulled from the race immediately. It was a test of endurance, strategy, and the bond between horse and rider, and only the strongest would survive. Thomas Blackwood rode past on Sovereign, the massive black stallion prancing with barely contained power. The wealthy breeder didn't speak, but the contempt in his eyes said everything words could not. He expected to win, expected to crush Eli's foolish dream beneath his horse's polished hooves, and he wanted Eli to know it. "Don't let him get in your head," said a voice beside him. Eli turned to find a young woman in riding clothes, her dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, her eyes the same shade of green as new spring leaves. "My father plays games with people's confidence. It's how he's won so many races before they even begin." "Elizabeth Blackwood," Eli said, recognizing her from the letters she had signed. "I didn't expect to see you here. I told you I'd be cheering for you." She smiled, but there was something sad beneath the expression. "My father doesn't know I'm here. He thinks I'm visiting friends in Colorado Springs. If he finds out I've been helping you..." She shook her head. "It doesn't matter. What matters is that you believe in yourself and Ghost. You've earned your place at this starting line. Don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." Before Eli could respond, the race marshal called for riders to take their positions. Elizabeth pressed something into his hand, a small silver horseshoe pendant on a leather cord, and then she was gone, disappearing into the crowd of spectators that lined the starting area. "For luck," Eli whispered, tucking the pendant into his shirt pocket. Then he mounted Ghost and guided her to their place among the other competitors. The starting gun shattered the morning silence, and 23 horses surged forward in a thunder of hooves and ambition. Eli held Ghost back, letting the eager front-runners burn their energy in the opening miles while they settled into a steady, sustainable pace. He had studied the course carefully, knew that the real challenges lay ahead in the mountain passes, and he wasn't about to waste their strength on early heroics. The first 10 miles passed in a blur of dust and determination. Ghost moved with effortless grace, her small hooves eating up the ground with a rhythm that felt almost musical. Other horses began to tire around them, their early speed taking its toll, but Ghost seemed to grow stronger with each passing mile, as if the challenge itself was feeding her spirit. At the first checkpoint, the veterinarians examined her with obvious skepticism, clearly expecting to find signs of strain in such a small animal, but her heart rate was steady, her breathing even, her legs showing no signs of the stress that was already beginning to show in larger competitors. "She's in better shape than horses twice her size," one of the vets admitted, shaking his head in disbelief. "Whatever you've been doing with her, keep doing it." They climbed into the mountains as the sun rose higher, the trail narrowing to a rocky path that wound between towering pines and sheer cliff faces. This was where Ghost's size became an advantage rather than a liability. While the larger horses struggled to navigate the tight switchbacks, their bulk working against them on the treacherous terrain, Ghost moved with the sure-footed agility of a mountain goat, finding paths that other animals couldn't even see. By the second checkpoint, they had moved from the back of the pack to somewhere in the middle, passing exhausted competitors who had pushed too hard too early. Sovereign was still in the lead, his powerful stride carrying Thomas Blackwood ahead of the field with apparent ease, but the gap was smaller than it should have been, and Eli could see the first flickers of concern in Blackwood's expression when he glanced back at the pursuing riders. "He's worried," Eli told Ghost as they left the checkpoint. "He expected to be miles ahead by now, and instead we're right here, breathing down his neck." He patted her sweat-dampened coat. "Let's give him something to really worry about." The third segment of the race took them across a river that had swelled with recent rains, its current swift and cold and unforgiving. Several horses balked at the crossing, their riders struggling to urge them into the churning water. But Ghost plunged in without hesitation, her powerful legs churning against the current, her head held high above the spray. They emerged on the far bank in fourth place, the leaders visible on the trail ahead, and Eli felt something shift in the air around them. The impossible was becoming possible. The dream was becoming real. The fourth checkpoint brought news that sent a ripple of shock through the remaining competitors. 2 of Blackwood's 3 horses had been pulled from the race, their legs showing signs of strain that the veterinarians deemed too dangerous to continue. Only Sovereign remained, still in the lead, but no longer surrounded by the protective buffer of his stablemates. Thomas Blackwood's carefully orchestrated dominance was crumbling, and the fury on his face was visible even from a distance. "He's pushing Sovereign too hard," observed the rider beside Eli, a weathered rancher named Jackson who had been competing in endurance races for over a decade, trying to build an insurmountable lead before the final climb. But that mountain doesn't care how much money you have or how many races you've won. It breaks horses that don't respect it. Eli nodded, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead where the true test awaited. The final 15 miles would take them over Redemption Pass, a brutal ascent to nearly 12,000 feet, followed by a treacherous descent that had ended more than one racing career. The thin air at that altitude would punish any horse that had been pushed beyond its limits, and the rocky terrain would show no mercy to tired legs. Ghost seemed to sense the challenge ahead. She had been moving with steady confidence all morning, but now there was something different in her bearing, a coiled intensity that reminded Eli of a predator preparing to strike. She knew this was where the race would be won or lost, and she was ready. They began the climb as the sun reached its zenith, the trail rising steeply through stands of ancient pine that gradually gave way to bare rock and scrubby alpine vegetation. The air grew thinner with each switchback, and Eli could feel Ghost's breathing deepen as her powerful lungs worked to extract oxygen from the rarefied atmosphere. But she never slowed, never hesitated, her small hooves finding purchase on terrain that would have challenged a mountain goat. Ahead of them, Sovereign was struggling. The massive stallion had dominated on the flatter sections of the course, his long stride covering ground with impressive efficiency, but the steep climb was exposing the limits of his breeding. His movements had become labored, his once proud head drooping with exhaustion, and Blackwood was whipping him mercilessly, demanding more than the animal had left to give. "Easy, girl," Eli murmured as they closed the gap. "Don't waste energy on anger. Save it for when it matters." They caught Sovereign halfway up the pass, Ghost's superior climbing ability finally overcoming the stallion's early lead. For a moment, the 2 horses ran side by side, their riders locked in a silent battle of wills that transcended the physical competition. Blackwood's face was twisted with rage and disbelief, unable to comprehend how this tiny white runt was challenging his champion. "You don't belong here," Blackwood snarled, his voice ragged with exertion. "You're nothing but a fraud, and when this is over, I'll make sure everyone knows it." Eli didn't respond. He didn't need to. Ghost spoke for both of them, surging forward with a burst of speed that left Sovereign gasping in her wake. The massive stallion tried to follow, but his legs had nothing left to give, and within moments, they had opened a gap that continued to widen with every stride. The summit of Redemption Pass offered a view that would have stolen Eli's breath, even if the altitude hadn't already done so. The Rocky Mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, their peaks touched with early snow, their valleys shrouded in purple shadow. For a moment, he allowed himself to simply exist in this place, this impossible moment that had seemed like pure fantasy just 2 years ago. "We're almost there," he told Ghost, his voice thick with emotion. "Just a little further, and we'll have done what everyone said couldn't be done." The descent was every bit as treacherous as he had feared. The trail plunged downward through loose scree and narrow ledges, requiring absolute concentration and perfect trust between horse and rider. One wrong step would send them tumbling into the abyss, ending their dream in the most permanent way possible. But Ghost navigated the dangers with the same sure-footed confidence she had shown throughout the race, her intelligent eyes reading the terrain and adjusting her stride accordingly. They passed the final checkpoint in first place, their lead over the remaining competitors now measured in minutes rather than seconds. The veterinarians examined Ghost with expressions of frank amazement, unable to believe that such a small horse could have conquered the most demanding course in the territory while showing fewer signs of fatigue than animals twice her size. "She's got the heart of a giant," Doc Harmon said, having traveled to Denver specifically to witness this moment. "I've never seen anything like it in 40 years of practice." The final 5 miles stretched before them, a relatively gentle descent through foothills that would deliver them to the finish line in Denver. Eli could hear the distant roar of the crowd, thousands of spectators who had gathered to witness the conclusion of the race, most of them expecting to see Thomas Blackwood claim another victory for his dynasty of champions. They were about to be surprised. Ghost ran with everything she had, her cream-colored coat dark with sweat, her breathing labored but steady, her spirit unbroken by the 50 miles of punishment she had endured. Eli leaned low over her neck, whispering encouragement that he wasn't sure she could hear over the thunder of her own hooves. "This is it, girl. This is what we've been fighting for. Show them what you're made of." The finish line appeared in the distance, a banner stretched across the road with crowds pressing against the barriers on either side. Eli could see faces turning toward them, expressions shifting from curiosity to disbelief to wild excitement as they realized what they were witnessing. The runt was going to win. Ghost crossed the finish line to a roar that seemed to shake the very mountains surrounding Denver. Eli barely heard it, his senses overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had accomplished. He slid from Ghost's back on trembling legs, his hands immediately finding her sweat-soaked neck, his forehead pressing against hers in a gesture of gratitude that transcended words. "You did it," he whispered, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "You beautiful, impossible girl, you did it." The crowd surged against the barriers, strangers reaching out to touch Ghost as if she were something sacred, something magical that had descended from the heavens to remind them that miracles were still possible. Race officials pushed through the chaos, their faces slack with disbelief as they confirmed what everyone had just witnessed. The smallest horse in the field had conquered the most demanding endurance race in Colorado, defeating champions bred for greatness by an animal that most people would have put down at birth. Martha Hensley was the first familiar face to reach them, the widow throwing her arms around Eli with a strength that belied her years. "I never doubted you," she said, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. Not for a single moment. "You're a terrible liar," Eli replied, laughing through his tears. "But I love you for it." Doc Harmon appeared next, his professional demeanor cracking into a grin that made him look 20 years younger. "Her vitals are remarkable," he announced after a quick examination. "She's tired, naturally, but there's no sign of the stress I'd expect after a race like this. It's like she was born for this kind of challenge." "She was born for people to underestimate her," Eli said, stroking Ghost's muzzle as she nuzzled against his chest. "That's what made her strong." The other competitors trickled across the finish line over the next hour, their expressions ranging from exhausted acceptance to bitter disappointment. Thomas Blackwood arrived in 7th place, Sovereign limping noticeably as they crossed the line, and the look he gave Eli was pure venom distilled into human form. "This isn't over," Blackwood hissed as he dismounted, his voice low enough that only Eli could hear. "You cheated somehow. I don't know how yet, but I'll find out, and when I do, I'll destroy you." "The only thing I did was believe in something you couldn't understand," Eli replied calmly, "and that's not cheating, that's faith." Before Blackwood could respond, Elizabeth pushed through the crowd and threw her arms around her father's rival with an enthusiasm that drew shocked gasps from nearby spectators. "You did it!" she exclaimed, her green eyes shining with joy. "I knew you would. I knew Ghost had it in her." "Your letters kept me going when I wanted to quit," Eli said, suddenly aware of how strange this moment must look to everyone watching. "I couldn't have done this without your help." Blackwood's face went pale as he processed what he was seeing. His own daughter, embracing the man who had just humiliated him in front of the entire territory. The betrayal was written in every line of his expression, a wound deeper than any racing loss could inflict. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice dangerous and cold. "What is the meaning of this?" "The meaning, Father, is that I'm tired of watching you crush people who dare to dream," Elizabeth replied, turning to face him with a defiance that seemed to surprise even herself. Eli Dawson and Ghost earned this victory. They earned it through hard work and sacrifice and a belief in something greater than money and bloodlines. You could learn something from them if you weren't so blinded by your own arrogance. The confrontation drew a crowd, spectators pressing closer to witness the drama unfolding between the territory's wealthiest horse breeder and his rebellious daughter. Blackwood's face cycled through several shades of red before settling into a mask of cold fury. "You're no daughter of mine," he said finally, each word dropping like a stone into still water. "Consider yourself disowned." Elizabeth flinched as if he had struck her, but she didn't retreat. "Then I'm finally free," she whispered. "Free to live my own life instead of the one you planned for me." Blackwood turned and stalked away, his defeated champion limping behind him, his entourage of handlers and trainers following in uncomfortable silence. The crowd parted before him like water before a ship's prow, and within moments he had disappeared into the maze of temporary stables and equipment tents. Eli watched him go with a mixture of satisfaction and concern. He had won the race, but he had also made a powerful enemy even more dangerous. Blackwood was not the kind of man who accepted defeat gracefully, and his threat about finding proof of cheating suggested that the battle was far from over. "I'm sorry," Elizabeth said, her voice small and uncertain. "I didn't mean to cause a scene. I just couldn't let him treat you like that after everything you've accomplished." "You have nothing to apologize for," Eli replied gently. "You stood up for what you believed in. That takes more courage than winning any race." The awards ceremony took place as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to celebrate Ghost's victory. Eli accepted the trophy and the prize money with humble grace, deflecting praise toward the small white mare who stood beside him, her ears pricked forward as if she understood exactly what was happening. "This belongs to her," he told the assembled crowd, holding up the silver cup so it caught the dying light. "I just had the privilege of being along for the ride." The applause that followed was the loudest sound Eli had ever heard, a thunder of appreciation that rolled across the Denver Valley and echoed off the surrounding mountains. And through it all, Ghost stood calm and proud. The runt who had become a champion, the discarded foal who had proven that heart matters more than size. The weeks following the race brought changes that Eli could never have anticipated. The prize money from the Rocky Mountain Endurance was enough to purchase a small piece of land outside Millbrook, 20 acres of rolling pasture with a creek running through it and a modest cabin that needed more repairs than he could count. It wasn't much by most standards, but to a man who had spent his entire life working other people's property, it felt like a kingdom. "Welcome home," Martha Hensley said as they stood together surveying the land on the day Eli signed the deed. "You've earned this, every square inch of it." Ghost explored her new domain with obvious delight, racing across the open pasture with a freedom she had never known before. Watching her run, her white coat blazing against the autumn grass, Eli felt something he had almost forgotten existed: peace. After a lifetime of struggle and uncertainty, He had finally found a place where he belonged. But peace, as he should have known, was never permanent on the frontier. Thomas Blackwood's revenge came not with violence, but with paper. 3 weeks after the race, a lawyer arrived at Eli's new property with a stack of documents alleging that Ghost had been obtained through fraudulent means. According to the complaint, the original owner of Ghost's dam had never properly transferred ownership, making Eli's purchase at the Millbrook auction legally invalid. If the court ruled in Blackwood's favor, Ghost would be seized and sold at public auction, with Blackwood conveniently positioned as the highest bidder. "It's nonsense," Martha declared after reading through the documents. "Pure fabrication designed to steal what you've rightfully earned." "Nonsense or not, it's going to court," Eli replied grimly, "and Blackwood has enough money to hire the best lawyers in the territory. I can barely afford to feed myself and Ghost, let alone fight a legal battle." The news spread quickly through Millbrook, and the reactions were predictably divided. Some people expressed sympathy for Eli's situation, viewing Blackwood's lawsuit as the vindictive act of a sore loser. Others whispered that perhaps there was truth to the allegations, that no horse as remarkable as Ghost could have come from such humble origins without some kind of deception involved. Elizabeth Blackwood arrived at Eli's cabin 3 days after the lawsuit was filed, her face pale with guilt and determination. She had been staying at a boarding house in town since her father's disownment, supporting herself with seamstress work while she figured out what to do with her unexpected freedom. "I know where he got those documents," she said without preamble. "My father has been collecting information on every horse sold in Colorado for years, looking for irregularities he could exploit. Most of the time, he uses it to acquire animals he wants at reduced prices. But this time," she shook her head, "this time he's using it for revenge." "Can you prove the documents are fabricated?" Eli asked. "I can do better than that." Elizabeth pulled a leather satchel from her shoulder and withdrew a sheaf of papers covered in her father's distinctive handwriting. "These are his personal notes on the case. He paid a clerk at the Territorial Land Office to alter records and create a false chain of ownership. It's all here, including the amount he paid and the name of the clerk involved." Eli stared at the papers in disbelief. "How did you get these?" "I went back to the ranch while my father was in Denver meeting with his lawyers. The staff still thinks of me as the young miss who grew up there. They let me walk right into his study." A ghost of a smile crossed her face. "He always underestimated me. I suppose that's one thing we have in common." The evidence Elizabeth provided was more than enough to destroy Blackwood's case and expose his corruption to the territorial authorities. But Eli hesitated, knowing that using these documents would mean complete ruin for the man who had already lost his daughter because of this feud. "He tried to take everything from you," Elizabeth said, sensing his reluctance. "He would have destroyed you without a second thought if I hadn't found these papers. You don't owe him mercy." "Maybe not," Eli agreed. "But I owe myself something better than becoming the kind of man who kicks someone when they're down." He looked at the papers in his hands, weighing justice against vengeance, necessity against principle. "I'll use these to defend myself if I have to, but I won't release them publicly unless he forces my hand." The court case never happened. When Blackwood's lawyers learned that their client's scheme had been exposed, they quietly withdrew the complaint and advised their employer to let the matter drop. The wealthy breeder had no choice but to accept defeat for the second time, his reputation intact only because Eli had chosen restraint over retribution. "You're a better man than I would have been," Elizabeth said when she heard the news. "Most people would have destroyed him for what he tried to do." "Destroying him wouldn't give me anything I don't already have," Eli replied, watching Ghost graze peacefully in the afternoon sun. "I've got my land, my horse, and my peace of mind. That's more than enough for one lifetime." The winter that followed was the mildest Eli could remember, as if the weather itself was celebrating his good fortune. He spent the quiet months making repairs to the cabin, building a proper stable for Ghost, and planning for the future he had never dared to imagine. Elizabeth visited often, their friendship deepening into something that neither of them had expected, but both had come to cherish. "She's asking about you," Martha reported one evening, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "Wondering if you might need help with the spring planting." "Is that so?" Eli replied, trying to hide his smile. "Well, I suppose an extra pair of hands wouldn't hurt." Ghost nickered from her stall, as if offering her own opinion on the matter. And somewhere in the distance, the first birds of spring began to sing. 5 years after Ghost crossed that finish line in Denver, Eli Dawson stood in the doorway of the expanded stable he had built with his own hands, watching the morning sun paint the Colorado mountains in shades of gold and rose. The 20 acres he had purchased with his prize money had grown to nearly 200, a proper ranch now with cattle grazing in the lower pastures and horses running free across land that belonged to him and no one else. Elizabeth stood beside him, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her hand resting on the gentle swell of her belly where their first child grew. They had married the previous spring in a small ceremony attended by Martha Hensley, Doc Harmon, and a handful of friends who had believed in them when belief seemed like madness. It was not the society wedding that Thomas Blackwood had once planned for his daughter, but it was filled with more love and genuine happiness than any gilded ballroom could contain. "She's showing off again," Elizabeth said, nodding toward the pasture where Ghost was teaching her latest foal to run. The young colt was white like his mother, though larger, with the same intelligent eyes and sure-footed grace that had carried Ghost to victory. He would never be as small as she was, but he had inherited something more valuable than her size. He had inherited her heart. "She's earned the right to show off," Eli replied, his voice thick with emotion. "She's earned everything." Ghost had raced twice more after that first legendary victory, winning both times by margins that left the competition wondering if they had even been in the same event. Then Eli had retired her from competition, not because she couldn't win anymore, but because she had nothing left to prove. The runt who had been dismissed as worthless had become the most celebrated endurance horse in Colorado history, her story told and retold in newspapers and saloons from Denver to San Francisco. But it was not the racing victories that Eli treasured most. It was the quieter legacy, the one that unfolded every day on the ranch they had built together. Ghost had produced 4 foals in the years since her retirement, each one carrying her extraordinary genetics into the next generation. Breeders who had once laughed at the idea of her bloodline now offered staggering sums for the privilege of crossing their mares with her offspring. The Dawson Ranch had become synonymous with horses that defied expectations, animals that proved size and pedigree mattered less than spirit and determination. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Elizabeth asked, leaning her head against his shoulder. "If you had taken my father's offer that day, if you had sold Ghost for $500 and walked away." Eli considered the question seriously, as he had many times over the years. $500 had seemed like a fortune to the broke cowboy he had been, enough to start over somewhere new and build a modest life free from uncertainty. But that life would have been built on surrender, on accepting that dreams were luxuries he couldn't afford, on believing what everyone else believed about his worth and his possibilities. "I think about it sometimes," he admitted, "but then I look at everything we have, everything Ghost made possible, and I know I made the right choice." He turned to face his wife, this woman who had sacrificed her inheritance and her family name to stand beside a man the world had written off as a fool. The money would have run out eventually. What Ghost gave me, what you gave me, that lasts forever. A commotion in the stable drew their attention. Martha Hensley emerged leading a visitor, A young man barely out of his teens with dust on his clothes and desperation in his eyes. He was thin and weathered, the kind of worn-down look that Eli recognized from his own past, and he was leading a horse that made Ghost's original condition seem robust by comparison. "Found this one at the gate," Martha explained. "Says he heard about your ranch and traveled 300 miles to ask for your help." The young man clutched his hat in trembling hands, his eyes darting between Eli and the pathetic creature beside him. "They told me you were the only one who might understand," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Everyone else says I should put her down, that she'll never amount to anything. But I can see something in her, Mr. Dawson. Something special. I just don't know how to bring it out." Eli studied the young horse, taking in the dull coat and prominent ribs, the scarred legs and wary eyes. She was damaged, certainly, neglected and mistreated by whoever had owned her before. But beneath the surface wounds, he saw something that made his heart skip. A spark of defiance, a refusal to surrender. The same impossible spirit that had drawn him to Ghost in that auction barn so many years ago. "What's her name?" Eli asked. "Haven't given her one yet. Didn't seem right until I knew if she had a future." Eli walked to the young horse and extended his hand, letting her smell his fingers, giving her time to decide whether he was friend or foe. After a long moment, she stepped forward and pressed her muzzle against his palm, her dark eyes meeting his with something that looked almost like hope. "Everyone deserves a future," Eli said quietly. "Everyone deserves someone who believes in them when no one else will." He turned to the young man with a smile that carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Welcome to Dawson Ranch. We've got work to do." Behind him, Ghost raised her head from grazing and watched the scene unfold, her white coat gleaming in the morning light. The legacy she had started with $50 and a dream was continuing, passing from one generation to the next, proving over and over again that the smallest and most unlikely among us can change the world if only someone believes in them enough to give them a chance. The mountains stood witness, as they always had, to the extraordinary things that ordinary faith could accomplish.